In the last episode, the Eastern and Western Army factions formed as Ishida Mitsunari gathered support for his cause in aims of halting the growing influence of Tokugawa Ieyasu. Yet his loose alliance is one that appears somewhat conflicted, as many of its members needed much convincing to enforce the status quo. Now, with both sides established, armed conflict is set to at last erupt. By the year 1600, a boiling point was imminent as the tension Tokugawa Ieyasu had been purposefully stirring was now reaching its very limits. From spring and into summer, Ieyasu had remained in Osaka, maintaining the role of Toyotomi Hideyori's guardian, a position he had commandeered after the death of Maeda Toshiie, and one that had led him to great influence but also caused great worry. Ieyasu's intentions were clear and indisputable. He was trying to seize the reins to the country for himself, and he had the backing of many. Unlike those who had taken the side of the Western Army, those who had sworn themselves to the Eastern faction were unwaveringly loyal to the Tokugawa. These clans included but were not limited to the Date, Hosokawa, Honda, Kato, Kurora, Maeda, Mogami, Fukushima, Ii, Toro, Hachisuka, Ikoma, Ikeda, Hori, Yamanochi, and Kyogoku. They each draw a stark contrast to those who had placed their faith in Mitsunari's Western Army faction, many of which needed some level of convincing, simply to not take the side of the powerful Tokugawa. The Western Army included but was not limited to Ishida, Mori, Ukita, Uesugi, Chosokabe, Shimazu, Otani, Konishi, Oda, Kobayakawa, Tachibana, Wakizaka, and Ogawa. The strongest clan in this coalition was the Mori, led by Mori Teramoto, who Mitsunari had aptly named the main commander-in-chief of the Western Army. And although the Mori forces alone were incredibly sizable, the addition of other regent figures such as Uesugi Kagekatsu brought in a further swell of numbers. Indeed, the Western Army had enough manpower to stand toe-to-toe with Ieyasu. If everyone just played their part and followed through, the Tokugawa grip could be contested. At this point in time, before any blood had been shed, before any shot had been fired, the odds were still roughly even, and Ieyasu had a very real possibility of being defeated. But manpower alone was not going to be what ultimately would decide this conflict, as the Western Army, although strong, was not nearly as loyal to the cause. I'm going to say it now and probably say it many more times, but this war to come was extremely unclear. No one really knew what was going to happen, who was going to still be standing when all was said and done. And it was a terrifying possibility that a mistake in judgment might be made, leaving one's clan completely ruined in the end if their side were to lose. Of course, this was the gamble Ieyasu was playing. This is what he was banking on, as if he did not simply transition into power on his own, he was willing to risk everything in pursuit of his ultimate ambition. Although he probably had some peace of mind knowing that the Western Army was so internally divided. In fact, this divide even went so deep that many clans themselves were internally conflicted, with family members and retainers all voicing their opinions about who they believe their clan should really be siding with. And surprisingly enough, as we will come to see, this existed in not only the Western Army, but also extended into the Eastern Army, which at face value appeared as the more unified of the two. And iconically, there is no more fine example of internal division than that of the Sanada family. Yet what is interesting to note is that this division was purposeful. The Sanada clan of Ueda is a family we have continued to examine from time to time, as they repeatedly have played large roles throughout the period, despite their small size. After the first siege of Ueda in 1585, a siege in which Masayuki successfully defended Ueda from Ieyasu, his sons Nobuyuki and Nobushige were both wed into prominent clans, both the Toyotomi and Tokugawa, to secure lasting alliances and future stability. In this, the Sanada had one foot in both camps, and Masayuki felt the Sanada safe for the foreseeable future. Little did he know that this new conflict was set to one day arise. His eldest son, Nobuyuki, had been wed to the daughter of Honda Tadakatsu, while his younger son, Nobushige, known more commonly today as Yukimura, had been wed to the daughter of Otani Yoshitsugu. And from the onset, it seemed rather simple that the Sanada would side with the Tokugawa, being that both Honda Tadakatsu and Otani Yoshitsugu supported Ieyasu. But as we know from the previous episode, Otani Yoshitsugu would end up switching his allegiance to his old friend Ishida Mitsunari. Thus now, both of Masayuki's sons sat at odds. Still, rather than outright siding with their new families they had married into, both sons looked to their father Masayuki to decide what course of action the Sanada clan should take. And this is where things get very interesting, because Masayuki, ever the strategist and wishing to ensure the survival of the Sanada, took a unique course of action. He and his son Nobushige would side with the Western Army at Ueda, while Nobuyuki would reluctantly be instructed to leave for his castle of Numata, where he would stand with the Eastern Army. This move ensured that no matter who won, either the Eastern or Western Army, the Sanada name would live on regardless. The unfortunate thing is that this placed Masayuki and Nobushige in the middle of a sea of Tokugawa support, as Ueda sat in the east and near the Tokugawa heartland. However, they were not totally alone in the east. One of the largest threats to the Tokugawa was still that of the Uesugi, who after being relocated from Echigo now ruled over Etsu domain. Uesugi Kagekatsu had been a staunch Toyotomi loyalist and was one of the most ardent supporters within the Western Army. His positioning as a powerful Western Army daimyo situated far into the east was cause for great concern to Ieyasu, who continued to watch Kagekatsu closely for what he may do. Kagekatsu, preparing for the war ahead, had been building up for some time, constructing new castles and fortifications, as well as better infrastructure to move his troops rapidly. In fact, Eastern Army clans around Etsu began to grow increasingly suspicious as well. In aims to get to the bottom of things, Ieyasu had dispatched a messenger to the Uesugi, who supposedly was also meant to act as a spy for the Tokugawa. Sensing this deception, the Uesugi tried to have the messenger killed. This may have been the last straw for Ieyasu, as now by midsummer of 1600, he demanded that Kagekatsu personally come to Osaka and explain his actions, which was actually quite ironic, seeing as how Ieyasu had refused to do the same exact thing when asked to do so by the other Gotairo regents. In Ieyasu's case, he wanted answers for the attempt on his messenger's life, but also the continued construction of fortifications and roads, as this was an obvious Uesugi military buildup. Kagekatsu, however, could care less. He would never come and bow before the man trying to usurp power away from the Toyotomi. To this end, Kagekatsu allowed one of his chief retainers, Naoe Kanetsugu, to reply to Ieyasu in what is remembered as the sensational Naoe letter. In this, Kanetsugu completely dismissed Ieyasu's demands and went on to further incite the rage of the Tokugawa. Upon reading his message, Ieyasu could not let it stand. The Uesugi had to be dealt with, but Ieyasu also knew that if he headed back east, his strongholds around Kyoto were forfeit, as without a doubt, Mitsunari would swoop in to seize them. By late July, after holding a war council to plan out the subjugation of Etsu, Ieyasu pulled out of Osaka and began a march back towards Edo. Famously, he would make a stop at Fushimi, Hideyoshi's former power base that Ieyasu had hijacked following his death. It was here he met with his lifelong friend and loyal retainer, Tori Mototara. The two are said to have shared a last somber drink together, as they both knew what the future would hold. As Ieyasu would continue his march back east, Mototara would stay behind with a small force to defend Fushimi. And although its fall was inevitable, he was bound and determined to fight to the death and slay as many Western Army soldiers as he could. Ieyasu probably knew he could never have asked for a more loyal and trusted ally. Upon the exodus of the Tokugawa back into the east, the door sat wide open for Mitsunari and the Western Army to seize Osaka, Fushimi, and any other outlying Tokugawa strongholds within the region. This in turn gave further confidence to Uesugi Kagekatsu, who was invigorated by the advance of the Western Army, who he thought would chase Ieyasu back eastward. Thus, within a couple of weeks after Ieyasu's departure, Kagekatsu ordered the commencement of his campaign. His goal was to march his armies south into the Kanto Plain, towards the Tokugawa capital of Edo. And with Mitsunari coming up from the west, Ieyasu would soon find himself trapped in between. However, although Kagekatsu was wary of the Tokugawa allies to the north, there must have been some level of misjudgment. There was anticipation that Ieyasu's allies would likely perform a counterattack against the Uesugi, but the rapidity of their strike must have caught Kagekatsu by surprise. As soon as he begun his campaign against the Tokugawa, Kagekatsu was alerted that Date Masamune and Mogami Yoshiaki had mobilized against him. Their combined assault on the border of Etsu was likely the first blood spilt of the entire conflict. Quickly, Kagekatsu diverted his armies back northward to hold off the Date and Mogami. And to this end, he would succeed in keeping them at bay. But unfortunately, his bulwark against the northern tide meant he could not spare any forces for an advance against the Tokugawa. This meant that the Uesugi, although contained, were not dealt with. More forces would be necessary to truly crush Kagekatsu's rebellion. And initially it was looking like further aid against the Uesugi would come up from the Maeda, as Maeda Toshinaga mustered his own army to go and aid the Date and Mogami. However, as Toshinaga was set to move out, his own clan would erupt into a vicious struggle, as his younger brother Maeda Toshimasa rose up and declared for the Western Army. The Maeda were now stuck with an internal crisis and were unable to join the fray. This left Ieyasu, who was weighing his own options of marching into Etsu to finish off the Uesugi. Yet, with the threat of the Western Army coming up from behind, his current objective was just to make it to Edo. However, with hostilities finally commencing, word quickly spread of the violence erupting in the east, and soon it would reach Kyushu, where Kato Kiyomasa and Kurora Nagamasa, upon learning of the Uesugi revolt, sprung into action. With the rest of Kyushu largely supporting the Western Army, both Kiyomasa and Nagamasa had their work cut out for them. Yet their impassioned crusade upon the island provided more than enough challenge to those who supported Mitsunari. Both Kiyomasa and Nagamasa held personal vendettas against people like Mitsunari and Konishi Yukinaga, and were all too eager to take the fight to them. And while Kiyomasa would continue his efforts on Kyushu, Nagamasa would soon depart for the east to join up with the rest of the Eastern Army commanders. By August, Ieyasu had reached Edo, while Mitsunari, along with other Western Army forces including the Mori, Shimazu, Kobayakawa, and Chosokabe were sweeping over the central region, seizing Osaka where the child Toyotomi Hideyori resided, before later continuing on to lay siege to Ieyasu's stronghold of Fushimi. It was here Tori Mototara carried out his duty for his lord Ieyasu, relentlessly defending the castle with his small garrison. For 10 days, 2,000 men held firm against 40,000. Until finally, with things dragging on too long and with casualties mounting, Mitsunari resorted to drastic measures, threatening to execute hostage family members of those inside if they did not surrender. Thus, by early September, fearing the consequences, a fire broke out within the castle walls, resulting in a breach that allowed Western Army forces to storm in. Mototara would continue to fight to the last man, until finally, surrounded by death and flames, he committed seppuku. In the end, his staunch defense of Fushimi had caused the deaths of around 3,000 Western Army soldiers, along with significantly delaying the advance of the Western Army eastward. This was a very unfortunate outcome for Mitsunari. Yet still, with Osaka and Fushimi secured, the Western Army now sat in control of central Japan, having ousted the major hubs of Tokugawa influence. Now it was Ieyasu's move. Was he to strike at the Uesugi or march back west to take out Mitsunari? The war had begun. So, what can we learn? By 1600, Uesugi Kagekatsu had been preparing for an armed conflict against Ieyasu, until finally his incitement of the Tokugawa ensued their wrath. Ieyasu, in fear of his domain getting invaded, left Osaka behind and marched back east, allowing his holdings in the central region to be seized by the incoming tide of the Western Army. However, Kagekatsu's campaign into Kanto would never truly pan out, as he would soon face a counterattack from the north as the Date and Mogami set upon him. With violence breaking out in the east, conflicts all across Japan erupted as general war begun between the eastern and western armies. In the next episode, Ieyasu plans to deal with Mitsunari. However, his march back west will not go as planned, as a massive portion of his army under the command of his son, Tokugawa Hidetada, would decide to go glory hunting against the Sanada at Ueda. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell if you enjoyed this video and found it to be most informative.